so far have largely concentrated on Britain and the United States. But now, at the start of the 20th century, it's the turn of the continent of Europe to take centre stage. Now, the relatively simple geopolitics of Britain and the USA will be confused by the full range of complexities stemming from the differences in language, in race, in religious beliefs, and in history. Now the vicissitudes of nationhood that will plague the world to this day will become fully apparent. As I wrote this talk, I was also reviewing an excellent book by Robert Harris, Officer and Spy. Please read it. It's a brilliant read in its own right. And for a study in the brittle, threatening atmosphere in France at the time. I'll refer to Harris's book several times during this talk. And finally, we are living in very uncertain times today. Populist politicians have lost the trust of their electorate, and indeed of one another. For the first time, the United States is threatened by another superpower, China. You may well find themes in the story of France and Germany that echo down across the century to our world today. So, to start by way of introduction, with my wider perspective, I never cease to be amazed at the extent to which history repeats itself, at the degree to which nations can dupe themselves, the ease with which whole peoples will go to war, and how unlearning we all are. Come back with me now to the end of the 19th century, to the 1870s, and the lead-up to the world of officer and spy. And come with me as I build up the background to France's capitulation and collapse of confidence, to Paris, at once the cultural centre of the world and also a city in turmoil, struggling to come to terms with its failures and defeats, and unwittingly laying the tracks for the unstoppable train of history running into the 20th and 21st centuries to today. Modern Germany was created in 1871. In his memoirs, the creator of Germany, the 19th century Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, wrote he'd always known he'd need a war with France to follow and cement the unification he'd created in the formerly independent northern and southern states of Prussia, Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria and Hesse-Darmstadt. He was convinced that the best way to cover up the differences between their cultures and their histories was to find war with a common enemy, and who better than their neighbour France. So the gauntlet was thrown. What was no less extraordinary was France's own eagerness to pick up the gauntlet almost before it could hit the ground. Her generals, brazenly confident of victory, reassured Emperor Napoleon III of France's supremacy. Parliament voted in Paris 101 to 47 in favour of la glory, and off they all went to war on August the 19th, 1870. Bismarck had chosen his moment well. In a series of lightning attacks, the German troops encircled the French, first at Metz and then Sedan. By September the 19th, Paris was being bombarded. The war eventually lasted just 5 months. France was defeated and in shock. The Emperor was taken in exile to London 2 years later, dying there in 1873. Though over so quickly, this was no insignificant backyard brawl. Germany suffered 117,000 dead or wounded. France 760,000, including nearly 150,000 dead. Humiliated, the French ego was in tatters, and the ripples of its humiliation would last to this day. But as with so many other historic events, it was the unplanned outcome, what I call the historical ripples, that were to overwhelm even the numbers of dead. These ripples were to lead to more suffering and to years of hatred and fear that barely ended in 1945. A first ripple. The future German Kaiser Wilhelm had as a prince ridden into battle with the cavalry and became convinced at the ease and speed with which a war could be fought, a misguided conviction that would carry over to his attack on France in 1914. "You will be home," he told his troops, "before the leaves have fallen from the linden trees." And despite the worn-out and protracted reality of World War I, the ripple of faith in speed would persist even to Hitler's reliance on blitzkrieg in the 1930s. A second ripple. In 1874, France was forced to pay enormous reparations to Germany, and it lost Alsace and Lorraine, which in turn it would seize back in its own reparations at the end of World War I in 1918, after it had beaten Germany, and thus generate part at least of the source of Hitler's justification for warmongering once again in the 1930s, as he sought Lebensraum and what he saw as Germany's rightful lands returned. And just as Berlin would suffer later in the 1940s, so this time in 1870 it was the turn of Paris, bombarded, starved to a standstill. There were no horses left when it ultimately surrendered. Victor Hugo, author of Les Miserables, had returned to Paris as the siege began. "We're eating horse," he said, "in every form." And a month later he told a friend, "People are making rat pâté," adding with a grisly glee, "It's really quite good." Several days later, he was one of the lucky ones still to have meat, only this time it was antelope, bear and stag, courtesy of a final dinner party at the Paris Zoo. The young César Ritz, who would open his hotel in the Place Vendôme 20 years later, produced elephant trunk at his restaurant Voisin. I can't resist this. The Parisians made the best of their culinary suffering as only the Parisians could. Here is a menu from the 100th day's celebrations of the siege, and includes stuffed donkey's head, elephant consommé, roast camel, and my special favourite, wolf haunch in a deer sauce. As always, dishes sound much better in French. Gigot de chien au petit pois, the dog recipe of the day. And Verdi, then living in Paris, was forced to delay the grand opening of Aida in Cairo for 2 years because he couldn't get his scenery or costumes out of the city and through the surrounding German lines. One other theme that was to repeat again and again throughout the next decades. The French common soldier who had fought heroically had had to live and die with the utter incompetence of their generals and officer elite. As is so often the case, the suffering, the humiliations, the losses, and the reparations led, especially in Paris, to self-criticism, self-loathing, fears in no way helped by the transformation in the balance of power in Europe. France was now eternally vulnerable, sandwiched between the twin powers of its age-old enemies, Great Britain and Germany. The country turned in upon itself, and it did so in 3 ways that would echo down the hallways of history and which are central to my story today and to Harris's account of the Dreyfus case that would erupt onto Paris in 1894. In the first place, French society split between the conservatives, the Catholics, the monarchists, what I'm calling the traditionalists on the one hand, and the new republicans, the free thinkers, the Democrats on the other. Gradually, there grew a polarization between those resisting change, unwilling to challenge previous thinking, determined to bolster often unjustified positions, and those, in many cases no less extreme or dogmatic, wanting to change everything and to purge the past. This polarization can best be seen for our purposes at any rate in the arts, in the army, and finally in scapegoating, in anti-Semitism. Let's take the arts first. For most of the 19th century, the Académie des Beaux-Arts had dominated French art. Here was the preserve of traditional French painting standards of content and style. Historical subjects, religious themes and portraits, especially those adding to the glory, la gloire again, of France, these were valued. Landscapes and still lives were not. Realism, brilliantly burnished, perfect. Nudes, yes, but only in allegorical or historic settings. Here is an example, Phryne, before the Athenian court. To my eyes, prudish, salacious, and not only to my eyes, here is your own Jeff Koons choosing this very picture to caricature. But as the Académie fought for its historic standards, so Paris had become the modern cultural cauldron of the world. And after being turned away repeatedly, in 1874, a new breed of artists created their own cooperative of paintings and sculptors in the face of harsh criticism. Monet, Cézanne, Morisot, Pissarro tried instead to catch the moment, to paint outdoors, to create the impression of reality. No black. When Cézanne died, his friend Clemenceau replaced the black shroud on his coffin with one of brightly coloured flowers. It was the scathing review in the newspaper of the day, Le Charivari, of Monet's painting Impression, Sunrise, that led to the term Impressionism. Wallpaper, in its embryonic state, is more finished than that impression of a seascape, is what the critic actually wrote. The fall of Paris in 1874 coincided with what came to be known as the start of the Belle Epoque. A brief glimpse at the artistic depth, the diversity and riches over the next 20 years saw living cheek by jowl with the Impressionists, with Cézanne, the sculptor Rodin, composers Debussy and Ravel, Émile Zola, Marie Curie and Freud. As an intriguing aside, an American who achieved great fame in this 19th century Paris was neither an author nor an artist. He was Napoleon III's dentist. I give you Thomas W. Evans, formerly of Philadelphia. Evans' influence over the emperor was so great that he reportedly dissuaded him from intervening in the American Civil War on the side of the South, and he was no less against war with Germany. And when Napoleon was captured at the end of the Franco-Prussian War that we've been just discussing, it was Evans who spirited the Empress Eugénie out of the country and to safety in England. I suppose the moral of the story is we should start paying a little bit more attention to our dentists. I could, by the way, spend the rest of this review talking about this remarkable man who ended his life fabulously rich from property speculation in Paris. Another of his clients and commercial confidants was Houseman, the great architect of the Paris we all know and love. It was at Houseman's instigation that green spaces in the centre of the city were expanded from just 40 acres in the old city to 4,500 acres in the new. And indeed, it was Houseman who created the gardens the Impressionists admired so much and painted so brilliantly. Evans returned eventually to the United States and wound up endowing the School of Dentistry in Philadelphia. The arts in Paris was a world of challenge and change. But in the army, little changed. Promotion was largely by seniority, and the officers marched to an unquestioning and largely unthinking code of obedience to orders. Uniforms remained gloriously resplendent, and only changed after the dreadful lessons of the first battles in 1914, as the commanders finally appreciated the devastatingly easy targets they were providing the German machine guns. More importantly for our story, the army turned in upon itself. Shamed by its military failure, it suppressed free thinking, stuck increasingly to its own class, its own cultures, and its own way of doing things. Above all, for all the superficial glamour, fun and attraction of the Belle Epoque, this was the time when anti-Semitism began to build an obscene and structural hold on a society looking for scapegoats, looking for someone to blame. Remember, the world of the 1890s was very different from today. No television, no World Wide Web, no radio. Instead, a proliferation of newspapers that championed all manner of ideas, extremist and radical. And our Philadelphia dentist, Thomas Evans, by the way, started the first American newspaper in Paris. As I said, a rich life, man of many parts. One of the leading French voices in the mainstream Paris press was that of Maurice Bar. In 1870, as a boy in Lorraine, Bar had watched his French soldiers proudly march to war, seen them retreating in humiliation a few days later, experienced the German takeover, and fled with his parents to Paris. By the end of the early 1890s, and now head of the Paris daily La Cocarde, Bar was pouring out the racial beliefs he had learned at the Sorbonne, a distortion of Darwinism, a perpetual searching for scapegoats, enemies within, and an explosive and unthinking cocktail of nationalism and self-serving racism. At its core, and led by France, by the Sorbonne in Paris itself, was eugenics, the science of improving the human population by controlled breeding. The iron logic of eugenics led to a knee-jerk rejection of foreigners, people who did not fit in, who could infect the purity of our own race, and to much of the underlying philosophy behind the future Nazi Holocaust. Here is Bar remembering his Sorbonne professor's apocalyptic lectures. Quote, "He had faith in the regenerative virtue of steel and fire. We must confirm the duel, the age-old struggle with Germany, our hereditary enemy, determined to master us. And it is our duty, our heroic joy, to fight for the sake of fighting, to remain pure, and to counter the Jew." Few Western countries escaped the virus of anti-Semitism or of eugenics. Even here in the United States, in the greatest polygenetic nation of all, there survives a ripple, a faint echo, in the form of an old stucco house. It's still standing. It overlooks Long Island Sound, and it is the Eugenics Record Office of the United States. Part of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, it was founded in 1910 with the aim of breeding purer citizens, and it was closed in 1944. Paris in November 1894 was at once the most vibrant city of culture, the centre of much scientific and intellectual discovery. It was also the focus of self-doubt, humiliation, of cover-up, and the breeding ground for unreason and racial extremism. And it was into this world that there came the first word of a Frenchman, a Jewish captain named Dreyfus, facing a secret court-martial for treason, for spying for Germany. And it's out of this maelstrom of political, cultural and social contradictions and divisions that Robert Harris has created his haunting page-turner whodunit. Harris is a master storyteller, and it's with the forensic clarity of a laser beam that he pushes much of the social context of the period that I've been talking about. He pushes this into the shadows, into the margins of his book. Instead, he concentrates on the gradually evolving thoughts, doubts, and then sheer bloody-minded heroism of one Colonel Picard as he unravels the army's plot, takes on his own national establishment, has the strength to speak truth to power, and takes on his own army. Very much a spectator at the start of the tale, Picard, like the rest of the thousands of Parisian rubberneckers, is an onlooker at the public humiliation of Dreyfus after he's been convicted by the court-martial. Bar, our newspaper editor, was there too. He'd been invited as a guest of honour to the public disgracing of the captain, whom he described next day in his paper as a Judas, a motionless Jew, battered by all the winds of hatred. As for Picard, he remains an onlooker, cool, almost indifferent at the onset, and then almost at once, and much to his surprise, he's appointed to command the Army's Secret Service, to lead the French 1890s equivalent of Homeland Security. Harris chooses Picard as the lens through which the tale unfolds. It's a stroke of contrarian genius, for Picard is no lovable hero. When they make the movie, this is no role for a Kevin Costner. Picard is a punctilious, self-absorbed, cold and humorous loner who has fully brought into his career in the French army. As much a disciplinarian as the others, he is, however, ringingly different in one respect. He's his own man, an independent thinker, and an unstoppable ferret for the truth. He is also widely socially connected. A social and religious agnostic, some of his closest friends were Jews, and he's no less widely artistically and socially cultivated. He dresses fastidiously. He soothes his mistress at a friend's salon listening to Debussy, the new musical sensation, and watching the young cellist Pablo Casals. The army has unwittingly made its first terrible mistake. It has appointed as its own chief of police a man entirely capable of standing up to authority and with the connections, brains, and sheer courage to be able to do it. Perhaps Ralph Fiennes should play the part in the movie when it comes, and indeed there's a chance for you to see that because Polanski is currently setting it up, the Dreyfus case, in Poland. Officers and Spy starts with a roar, straight into the Dreyfus public degradation. It moves to Picard's unexpected promotion, and then as Dreyfus starts his decade of suffering, shackled, wasting away in solitary confinement on Devil's Island, French Guiana off the South American coast, the book largely turns back and inward into Paris of 1900. We stay in Paris and share with Picard the deadening and stressful experience. I'm sure many of you have had something similar in your careers of taking over a new command amongst staff who don't want you, and in a setup you increasingly find you condemn. Picard unsuccessfully tries to transform his team, to break through the sullen silences, the lack of imagination and creative thought, and then slowly start to question, to doubt, and then to unravel what is in fact one of the greatest cover-ups in European history. This is a story about two lonely men unexpectedly working thousands of miles apart to a common end. At the start, unbeknown to him, it was Picard's own department that had earlier fabricated the false evidence, underwritten the secret court-martial, and now masterminding the cover-up led by one of his own majors, Major Henri, and by a staff officer, Colonel Paty de Clam, on behalf of the Army Staff Generals and the Minister of War. The Army made its first mistake in recruiting Picard. It no less made a mistake in choosing Dreyfus as its victim. A little shred of a man, they're determined he'll perish, manacled and forgotten, far away from home. But for all his terrible suffering, he too remains steadfast. His life-saving love for his wife, Lucy, and hers for him, defiant throughout. Dreyfus, his immediate and extended family, were in fact an exemplary case of all that the Conservatives, Catholics and the army detested, possibly feared. Hugely prosperous through textiles, the young Dreyfus came from Alsace. Yes, the Alsace fought over, first in 1870, again in 1914, and then again in 1939. He spoke German as a first language. Most in Alsace did. Of course, the point was used against him in the bogus secret trials. And he, like Bar, watched in horror as the Franco-Prussian War unfolded and became his driver to join the French army. He did so with distinction, the École Polytechnique, artillery school at Fontainebleau, and finally the elite war college where, and you couldn't invent this if you tried, one of his professors was the young Picard. And finally, he joined the general staff, the only Jewish officer and the first one ever to serve in the French general staff. Gradually the themes start. The cold-eyed Picard realizing the enormity of his challenge, the stubbornly resilient Dreyfus and his family. A masterstroke by Harris is the off-the-wall depiction of the love affair through the brutal lens of the army censoring their desperate letters to each other and suppressing them. And the third theme, the steady step-by-step collapse of the cover-up. The destruction of Duclam's efforts, of Major Henri and others, of Picard's own offices, and the discovery of the real culprit, an army lowlife, Major Ferdinand Esterhazy. Gradually, a groundswell of opinion changes. Dreyfusards emerge supporting or complementing the efforts of Picard, and culminating in the newspaper championship of Émile Zola, first in Le Figaro and then in L'Aurore, in probably the most famous front page in newspaper history. On January the 12th, 1898, he published J'accuse in L'Aurore, the paper edited and run by his friend Clemenceau. In 25 pages, Zola summarized the entire complex case and exposed the rottenness at the heart of the army and of the government. Written in the form of an open letter to the President of the Republic, it ends with a passionate series of accusations that rang out like rifle shots, naming Duclam, recently promoted colonel, the conniving generals, the Minister of War himself. It was a sensation. The newspaper sold out 300,000 copies, hawked by 100 new street vendors hired for the week, and it divided Paris. Zola's effigy was burned. Mobs attacked his home. Bar demanded a trial. Marcel Proust, Sarah Bernhardt, Monet were all passionate supporters of Zola. But Sarah Bernhardt's son was not. Nor were Degas or Renoir. Both were anti-Semitic. The Catholic Church, remember France was a Catholic state, sought Zola's destruction. Pizarro wrote to his son, "We're threatened with a clerical dictatorship, a union of generals with the sprayers of holy water." And let there be no doubt at Zola's heroism. For the conservatives, and by association, the heroism of Picard, the conservatives had their way. Zola was indeed put on trial, found guilty, and fled for his life to London, to cries of death to Zola, death to the Jews. There were more retrials, more recriminations, more desperate efforts to silence Picard and his team. The army tried to murder him as well, to silence the Dreyfusard appeals. But the pressure, as it always does, told. Henri, also by now promoted colonel, pieces of silver for his treachery, committed suicide. The cover-up cracked, and finally, Dreyfus' 8-year ordeal was over. Here at the apotheosis of the story is Harris in full flight. The voice is that of Picard. It's almost 7. I take a seat just behind Matthew Dreyfus, who turns and shakes my hand. Lucy nods to me, her face as pale as a midday moon, and manages a brief smile. The lawyers enter clad in their black robes and their strange conical black hats. The giant figure of Laborie gesturing with elaborate courtesy to the older lawyer des Manèges to go ahead of him. And then a cry from the back of the court, "Present arms." A clash of 50 boots stamping attention, and the judges file in, led by the diminutive Colonel Jouet. He wears a white bushy moustache, even larger than Biot's, so huge the top of his face seems to peer over it. He mounts the stage and takes the central chair. His voice is dry and hard. "Bring in the accused." The sergeant usher marches to a door near the front of the court. His tread is very loud in the sudden silence. He opens the door and 2 men step through. One is the escorting officer and the other is Dreyfus. The courtroom gasps, I among them, for he's an old man, a little old man. With a stiff-limbed walk and a baggy tunic, his frame is too shrunken to fill. His trousers flap around his legs. He moves jerkily to the middle of the courtroom, pauses at a couple of steps that lead to the platform where his lawyers sit, as if to summon his strength, and then mounts them with difficulty, salutes the judges with a white-gloved hand, and takes off his cap to reveal a skull almost entirely bald, except for a fringe of silver hair at the back, which hangs over his collar. He's told to sit. And then Jouy says, "Accused, stand." He struggles back to his feet. And that started the final retrial. We've used Dreyfus as a way into this time. In this section, I want to examine the ripples that were created. What are the protagonists in the story? What happens after Dreyfus is finally pardoned? How does history unfold? Well, first of all, Esterhazy. What of the real traitor? Discreetly and shamefully put on a military pension with the rank of major, the man who really sold secrets to the Germans shaved his moustache, fled France for England, to Milton Road, in the village of Harpenden, a nowhere street in a nowhere suburb just outside London, where he lived happily for 30 years. De Clam, the coordinator of the cover-up and an example of the unthinking follower of military authority, but no less heroic for all that. Certainly he had a personal honour code that was worthy of respect. He resigned from the army when Dreyfus was pardoned in 1900 and was then readmitted in 1913 at his own urgent request to be sent to fight in the front. Wounded twice at the First Battle of the Marne, he was decorated for heroism and died 2 years later in 1916. But whatever his own honour code, his story does not end there, and nor should the opprobrium. Here is another of those stupendous ripples in the terrible seas of history. For his son would achieve infamy 25 years later as the Vichy government's General Commissioner for the Jewish question, and narrowly escape execution by the Allies for his role in facilitating the Holocaust. Let's get on to more positive country. Clemenceau, higher ground. The editor of Le Roi, champion of Monet, a regular visitor to Monet's home in Giverny, responsible for pushing his aged friend to paint arguably the greatest painting of the era, the 8 murals that make up the water lilies. You can see them in the Musée de l'Orangerie at the western corner of the Tuileries Gardens. But there's much more about Clemenceau. He is to achieve a preeminent place in the pantheon of French heroes. Nicknamed the Tiger, he would become France's Prime Minister and lead them to the end of the First World War, and then, and here comes another ripple, at the Treaty of Versailles with Woodrow Wilson, Orlando and Lord George, drive through the excessive reparations that would in part at least lead to Hitler and World War II. The stature of Clemenceau in the Hall of Fame is such that Eliot Cohen features him alongside Lincoln, Ben-Gurion and Churchill in his study of wartime leadership. Zola, the novelist titan, the author of Germinal and Thérèse Raquin, and the winner of the first 2 Nobel Prizes for Literature in both 1901 and 1902, returned to Paris in 1900 and died 2 years later. Or did he? He may have been murdered. Yet another ripple. One chilly night he retired to bed, leaving his coal fire burning. The house was locked and bolted, as was his custom, for Zola still received death threats for his part in the Dreyfus scandal. He was dead the next morning from carbon monoxide poisoning. No amount of detective work could explain the death. But some years later, a Parisian roofer claimed on his deathbed that a Roman Catholic, he had closed the chimney in revenge for J'accuse, unclosing it the next morning when he returned to his roof repairs. Zola's death was met by an outpouring of grief and tributes around the world. And it also gave rise to a moving moment that relates to our story. The day before the funeral, a colonel in full dress, wearing the Legion of Honour, appeared quietly at Zola's Rue de Bruxelles address and kept vigil at attention throughout the night beside the grieving Madame Zola. It was, of course, Alfred Dreyfus. And what of Dreyfus? Declared innocent, pardoned, and despite permanently affected health, he re-entered the army at the outbreak of World War I, fought at Chemin des Dames and Verdun, and was honoured for heroism. He lived till 1935 and died aged 75. When Zola's memory was honoured by being interred at the Pantheon many years later, Dreyfus led the procession's honour brigade through Paris. And finally, what of Georges Picquart? Promoted to general, he became Clemenceau's first Minister of War. Ever the career soldier, he returned to the army as a 2-star general, and he died on January the 19th, 1914. Not in battle, but falling from his horse. Bismarck created modern Germany. He also set in motion a series of repeated international cycles, what I've called my historic ripples. First the Franco-Prussian War, and then 2 world wars. But the ripples of connectivity do not stop there. Instead, they lead to what would perhaps have been to Bismarck, and certainly to the French of the Belle Epoque, the most unexpected of consequences of the Dreyfus case. For on that dreadful day in January 1895, at the start of it all, there was another man of destiny watching Dreyfus' public humiliation. A young Austrian correspondent called Theodore Hetzel. And it was his experience that day, and in its aftermath, watching the mob, watching the army, and reading the press in Paris, the Western city of culture, that led him to the conviction that Jews would never be assimilated into other nations. Instead, he realized they had to create a state of their own. They had to have their own capacity to enforce mutual understanding and respect for their values, their beliefs, their own peoples. They, too, had to have the power and identity associated with and capable of maintaining nationhood. 1 year later, in 1896, Hetzel published The Jewish State and became the father of Zionism, directing and leading the steps to the creation of modern-day Israel. Robert Harris has presented a whodunit, page-turner of an historic frame-up for treason. And in so doing, he's chosen a moment in time that I've said echoes down the hallways of history. This is a tipping point, a moment when the repeated patterns of war, society, culture, and individual heroism and treason coalesce and make you want to find out more. In case you do, I have 2 other recommendations that will prolong the enjoyment. The first, a charming, seductive and readable account of La Belle Epoque in 2 volumes by the no less charming historian Mary McAuliffe of Maryland University. and the second is The Embrace of Unreason by Frederick Brown, a masterful review of the disturbing cultural disintegration of the Third Republic from 1914 to 1940, the follow-on from the Franco-Prussian War. And finally, I've said that this is a story that has echoed down the hallways of history, and it continues to do so. I fear that despite our advances in technology, despite the wonderful and real improvements to life that we enjoy, certainly here in the developed West, despite all that, the ripples of hatred and dogma, cover-up, dishonesty and unreason still undermine any claim we may have to full civilization or to freedom. I love France. My mother was French. And yet even now Marine Le Pen and her far-right racist party are winning significant and growing voters in France. 27% at the last count, almost a winning number. I love Britain. I am British. And UKIP could now be a force to reckon with. It's won its first seat in the House of Commons and certainly influenced our European elections. The United Kingdom Independent Party, it too is fascist, racist, isolationist and anti-immigration. In Britain, France and also in Greece, Belgium and Hungary, neo-Nazi groups are gaining popularity. The never-ending cycle of scapegoating, brutality and unreason goes on. Thank you so much for listening to me.